The alarm on the holding deck screamed before I even reached the viewing window, and my hands were already shaking when I pressed them against the glass. 3 guards surrounded him. He stood with his wrists bound in restraint cuffs, his uniform torn at the shoulder, and yet he did not look afraid. I had studied hundreds of species across dozens of worlds during my years with the Coalition. I had never seen a creature look at its captors the way this human looked at his. His name was Ethan Hale. I had read his file only minutes before. A soldier from the small, fragile species that our fleet had clashed with near the outer trade lanes. A skirmish had gone wrong. His transport had been damaged, his crew scattered, and he alone had been captured and brought aboard our station for what my superiors called behavioral study. I called it something else in my private thoughts. Curiosity. The kind that keeps you awake at night. The guard closest to him, a broad Dratul soldier, with plated skin and a voice like grinding stone, leaned down and said something meant to frighten him. I could not hear the words through the glass, but I saw the shape of them, a threat, a promise of pain if he did not cooperate. Ethan Hale smiled. It was such a small thing, that smile, and yet it unsettled me more than any weapon I had ever faced. Humans were supposed to be soft, short-lived, easily broken. That was what the reports said. That was what I had been taught since my first year of service. And here was one of them, cuffed and outnumbered, smiling at a creature twice his size as though he knew something the guard did not. I pressed the comm switch beside the window. My voice came out steadier than I felt. What is happening in there? The technician beside me, a thin Sivrani officer named Doss, did not look up from his console. Standard intimidation procedure, Officer Veyron. The command wants to see how the specimen responds under threat. Specimen. The word sat wrong in my chest, though I could not yet say why. He does not look threatened, I said. Doss finally glanced at the screen, his eyes narrowing. No, he does not. The guard shoved Ethan Hale, hard, and he stumbled back against the wall but did not fall. He straightened his shoulders, exhaled slowly, and said something in his own language. My translator earpiece caught it a half-second later. Is that the best you've got? I felt something strange move through me, quick and unfamiliar, like a current under still water. I did not have a word for it then. I would learn the word later, from him. The guard raised a hand as if to strike, and I found myself gripping the edge of the console so tightly my knuckles ached beneath my skin. But the strike never landed. A voice from the overhead speaker cut through the tension, cold and commanding. Enough. Bring him to interrogation room 4. Command wants him coherent, not damaged. The guards pulled back, and Ethan Hale let out a slow breath, the kind that told me his calm had cost him something. He was not fearless. He was simply refusing to show fear, and there was a difference between the two that I found myself desperate to understand. I left the observation deck before Doss could ask why my hands had not stopped trembling. The corridors of the outpost were narrow and gray, built for function rather than comfort, humming faintly with the sound of recycled air. I walked quickly, my mind circling back again and again to the image of that smile. I told myself it was professional interest. I told myself a good officer studies her enemy closely, learns his patterns, understands his weaknesses. But I did not walk toward the interrogation room to study a weakness. I walked there because I needed to see him again. I arrived just as they were pushing him through the door, his cuffs finally removed, his wrists red from where the restraints had pressed too tight. He rubbed at them absently, glancing around the room with the calm curiosity of someone touring a museum rather than a prisoner awaiting judgment. Commander Sale, the officer overseeing his capture, stood near the far wall with her arms folded. She was Keshtari like me, older, colder, the kind of officer who had risen through the ranks by treating every soft feeling as a flaw to be corrected. "You're staring, Officer Veyron," she said without turning. "I was assigned to observe the specimen's behavioral patterns," I answered, keeping my voice level. "I thought it best to begin now." She studied me for a long moment, her pale eyes narrowing slightly, and then she nodded once. "Then observe. But remember what he is. a soldier from a species with a violent, self-destructive history. Do not mistake his composure for peace." I did not answer. I only looked past her, to where Ethan Hale sat now in a plain metal chair, his hands resting loosely on his knees, watching the room the way a man watches weather roll in, waiting to see which direction it would move. When his eyes met mine through the reinforced glass separating the observation alcove from the main room, something in his expression shifted. Not fear, not anger, something closer to recognition, as though he understood, somehow, that I was the only person in that room who was truly looking at him. "You're the one who stopped them," he said, and though he could not have known I had done nothing at all, the words still struck me strangely. "Back there, in the hall." I frowned, glancing at Commander Sale, who had already turned away to speak with another officer near the door. "I did not stop anything," I said quietly, my translator carrying the words to him in his own tongue. "You didn't have to," he said. "I saw your face on the monitor. You looked like you wanted to." I did not know how to answer that, so I said nothing at all, and he did not push. He simply leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes for a moment, as though gathering some private strength, and waited for whatever would come next. I stayed at that window far longer than my duties required. I told myself it was research. I told myself I was building a report for command, cataloging his reactions, his posture, the strange steadiness that seemed to live beneath his skin even in captivity. But when Commander Sale finally noticed how long I had lingered and ordered me back to my post, I realized the truth I had been avoiding since the moment I saw him smile at a threat meant to break him. I was not observing a specimen. I was watching a man refuse to be afraid, and something in me, something old and quiet, that I had never given voice to, wanted desperately to understand how he did it. That night, alone in my quarters, I pulled up his file again on my personal console. Ethan Hale, 28 years of age by human reckoning, a soldier with an unremarkable record until the day his transport was struck and his crew scattered across 2 systems. The report noted, almost as an afterthought, that he had refused evacuation until every member of his unit had been accounted for, even after his own vessel began losing atmosphere. I read that line 3 times. Humans, the coalition manuals insisted, were reckless, sentimental, prone to acts that served no strategic purpose. I had accepted that description without question for most of my career. But reading his file now, I began to wonder if what my superiors called recklessness was something else entirely. Something my own people, for all our discipline and order, had quietly forgotten how to feel. The next morning, word spread through the station like static before a storm. Command had decided the human prisoner would be tested, not through instruments or interrogation, but through combat. A demonstration, they called it, a way to measure the true limits of human physiology under pressure, and, though no one said it aloud, a way to remind every other species aboard the station that humanity's reputation for defiance was nothing more than a story that would end quickly against real strength. I heard the announcement standing in the corridor outside the mess hall, and my stomach turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with fear for myself. They were going to send someone in against him, unarmed, barehanded, and somewhere beneath my training, beneath every rule I had followed since I first put on this uniform, a single thought rose up clear and unwelcome. I did not want to watch him lose. I did not fully understand yet why the thought of his defeat felt like something breaking inside my own chest, why the idea of that steady, quiet strength being crushed for entertainment made my hands curl into fists at my sides. I only knew that when the doors to the combat deck opened later that day, I would be standing at the window again, unable to look away, waiting to see what a man like Ethan Hale did when the whole world expected him to fall. Doss found me an hour before the match, waiting near the entrance to the lower deck where the demonstration had been arranged. He did not ask why I was there. He simply handed me a datapad and said, quietly, that Commander Sile wanted the observation logged in full detail this time. No gaps, no distractions. I told him I understood. I did not tell him that my hands had not stopped trembling since the moment I heard the word combat. The lower deck had been built originally for cargo transfer, a wide open space with a reinforced floor and a raised platform along one side where officers could observe without risk. Word of the demonstration had traveled fast, and by the time I arrived, a small crowd of officers from 3 different coalition species had already gathered along the platform rail, murmuring among themselves in low, curious tones. I found a place near the edge, close enough to see everything, far enough that no one would notice how tightly I was gripping the rail. Below, in the center of the open floor, Ethan Hale stood alone. They had given him no weapon, no armor, only the same simple uniform he had worn since his capture, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, his expression unreadable in a way that made my chest ache with something I could not name. Across from him stood the one they had chosen to face him, a Drotul enforcer named Korath, easily twice Ethan's height, his plated shoulders wide enough to block a doorway, his reputation on the station built from 3 years of undefeated matches against soldiers from a dozen different worlds. He had never lost. He had, according to the officers around me, never even been forced to fight for longer than a few minutes. "This will be over quickly," said a voice beside me. I turned to see a young Sevrani officer, barely out of training, watching the floor below with open fascination. They say the human species collapses under sustained pressure. No endurance, no real strength. I did not answer him. I kept my eyes on Ethan Hale, who had not moved from his spot in the center of the floor, who was watching Korath approach with the same calm, steady attention he had shown the guards who threatened him the day before. Commander Sale's voice crackled over the speaker system, cold and formal. "Begin." Korath moved first, and he moved fast, for something so large, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, one massive arm swinging toward Ethan's shoulder with enough force to end the match in a single motion. Ethan was not there when the arm arrived. I did not fully understand what I had seen until several seconds later, when my mind finally caught up with my eyes. He had stepped aside, just slightly, just enough, and Korath's momentum carried him past, off balance for the first time in 3 years. A murmur ran through the officers along the rail. Korath recovered quickly, turning with a low growl, and this time he did not charge. He circled, slower, more careful, and Ethan circled with him, matching his movements, watching his shoulders, his weight, the small shifts that came before every strike. "He's studying him," I said quietly, more to myself than to anyone beside me. "Studying," the young officer repeated, as though the word tasted strange in his mouth. "Studying a fight." Korath struck again, a heavy blow aimed at Ethan's chest, and this time Ethan could not fully avoid it. The impact sent him stumbling back several steps, and a sharp gasp rose from somewhere along the rail, half hope, half satisfaction. I felt my own breath catch painfully in my throat. But Ethan did not fall. He planted his feet, steadied himself, and exhaled slowly, the same breath he had taken before the guards in the corridor the day before. And I understood then that this was not fearlessness at all. It was something he was choosing, deliberately, again and again, no matter how much it cost him. Korath pressed his advantage, swinging again, and this time Ethan caught the arm, using the creature's own momentum against him, turning his weight in a way that sent Korath stumbling forward past him. It was not a large advantage. It would not have ended the fight against a smaller opponent. But it bought him a few seconds, and a few seconds, I was beginning to realize, was all a creature like Ethan Hale needed. The fight stretched on longer than anyone along that rail had expected. Korath struck, and Ethan absorbed what he could not avoid, staggering, recovering, circling again. Each time he was struck, something in me flinched, as though I had felt it myself, and each time he rose back to his feet, something else in me rose with him, fierce and unfamiliar and impossible to ignore. "He should have fallen by now," the young officer beside me murmured, his earlier confidence beginning to crack. "No one lasts this long against Korath. No one." I said nothing. I only watched as Ethan, breathing hard now, blood at the corner of his mouth, straightened his shoulders one more time, and looked directly at Korath with the same steady calm he had shown from the very beginning. "You're getting slower," Ethan said, his voice carrying across the floor, translated a half-second later into a dozen different languages through the earpieces along the rail. "I'm just getting started." It was, I would later learn, mostly a bluff. But it worked. Korath, frustrated, perhaps for the first time in 3 years genuinely uncertain of his own victory, charged forward without the careful patience he had shown before, and that single mistake was the opening Ethan had been waiting for through every blow he had endured. He moved low, inside the reach of those long arms, and drove his shoulder into Korath's chest, with every remaining ounce of strength his body had left. It should not have been enough. Korath outweighed him by a staggering margin. But the angle was right, and the momentum was wrong for Korath, and the enforcer stumbled backward, off balance for the second time that day, his footing failing him on the smooth deck plating. He went down. The room fell utterly silent. Ethan Hale stood over him, breathing hard, one hand pressed briefly to his ribs, and he did not gloat, did not raise his arms in victory, did not do any of the things I might have expected from a soldier celebrating an impossible win. He simply extended a hand toward Korath, an offer to help him rise, and the gesture confused the enforcer so completely that he simply stared up at him for several long seconds before finally accepting it. Commander Sale's voice, when it finally came over the speaker, was tight with something I did not recognize in her before that moment. "Match concluded. Return the specimen to holding." The crowd along the rail began to disperse, murmuring among themselves in tones I could not quite read, disbelief, unease, something close to reluctant respect. The young officer beside me had gone very quiet, staring down at the floor where Korath was being helped away by 2 attendants. I remained at the rail long after the others had gone, watching as they led Ethan Hale back toward the holding corridor, his steps slower now, his body clearly aching from the effort he had spent, and yet his head remained level, his shoulders remained steady, as though nothing that had just happened surprised him at all. I did not fully understand what I felt in that moment. It was not simple admiration, though there was admiration in it. It was not simple curiosity, though curiosity remained. It was something deeper and more frightening, a pull toward him that I could not explain through any behavioral report or coalition manual. Alone on that platform, with the last officers filing out behind me, I whispered the words before I even realized I intended to say them. "I wish he were mine." I did not know, in that moment, what I meant by it. I only knew that the thought had risen from somewhere I could not control, somewhere beneath rank and duty and every rule I had followed for years, and that once spoken, even quietly, even only to myself, it could not be taken back. I requested reassignment the following morning, before I had even fully decided what words I would use to justify it. Commander Sale listened to my proposal without expression, seated behind her desk with her hands folded in front of her, the light from the narrow window catching the pale gray of her eyes. I told her that continued study of the human specimen required close, sustained observation, that behavioral data collected from a distance would always be incomplete, that understanding his patterns of speech and thought required direct interaction rather than recorded footage. Every word of it was true. None of it was the real reason I stood before her that morning. "You want to become his liaison," she said when I finished. It was not a question. "I want to complete an accurate report, Commander." She studied me for a long moment, long enough that I felt the urge to look away, though I forced myself to hold her gaze instead. Finally she nodded, slowly, though something in her expression suggested she saw more of my intentions than I wished her to. "You will have 3 cycles," she said. "After that, Command will decide whether the specimen has further value or whether he should be processed through standard channels." I did not ask what standard channels meant. I did not want to know. They moved him from the holding cell to a small, sparse quarters near the officers' section, still monitored, still restricted, but no longer treated as a prisoner in the strictest sense. I told myself this was simply protocol for a subject undergoing extended study. I did not examine too closely why the news of his improved conditions had made something in my chest loosen for the first time in days. I met him there on the first evening of my new assignment, carrying a data pad I did not truly need, my heart beating faster than any professional interaction should have caused. He was sitting near the narrow window when I entered, watching the distant stars scroll past as the station rotated slowly through its orbit. He turned when the door opened, and though I expected wariness, what I found instead was something closer to curiosity. "You're the one from the platform," he said. "I saw you there, during the fight." "I am Officer Veyron," I said, keeping my voice level, professional. "I have been assigned to conduct behavioral study during your continued stay here." "Veyron," he repeated, the syllables slightly unfamiliar in his mouth. "That's a nice name." I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, and busied myself instead with the datapad in my hands, though I could not have said afterward what I had typed into it. We spoke for nearly an hour that first evening, our conversation halting at first, filtered through the small translator device resting on the table between us. He asked questions about my species, about the coalition, about the stars visible through his narrow window, and whether any of them were familiar to me. I found myself answering more openly than caution should have allowed, drawn in by the easy warmth of his attention, the way he listened as though my answers genuinely mattered to him rather than serving merely as data. "Why did you help him up?" I asked eventually, the question I had been holding since the moment I watched him extend his hand to Korath on the combat deck. "After you won, why help the one who tried to defeat you?" Ethan considered the question for a moment, resting his forearms on his knees. "He didn't do anything wrong," he said finally. "He was just following orders, same as I was. No reason to hold that against him once it was over. Even though he might have injured you severely, had the outcome gone differently." "Especially then," Ethan said, and something in his voice carried a weight I did not fully understand. "That's kind of the point. You don't get to decide someone deserves less kindness just because things got hard between you." I turned that thought over long after I left his quarters that night, walking the quiet corridors back toward my own small room, unable to reconcile it with anything I had been taught about strength or victory or the proper treatment of an opponent. My people valued discipline, order, the clean division between friend and enemy. Ethan Hale seemed to carry no such division within him at all, and yet he had still walked into that fight willing to give everything he had. Over the following days, I returned to his quarters often, sometimes for the official interviews command required, more often simply because I found myself wanting to. We spoke of small things, foods from his homeworld he missed, music he sometimes hummed under his breath when he thought no one was listening, stories about the crew he had served alongside before the skirmish that led to his capture. It was during one such conversation that I finally understood why he had chosen to fight Korath bare-handed in the first place, a detail the official reports had never fully explained. "They told me if I refused the match," he said quietly, staring at his hands, "they'd hold my crew responsible for the incident instead. Say we provoked the confrontation deliberately. I couldn't let that happen to them, not for something that wasn't really their fault. You chose to risk your own safety, to protect people who were not present, who could not know what you had sacrificed on their behalf," I said slowly, testing the shape of the idea as I spoke it aloud. "That's what you do for your crew," he said simply, as though the logic required no further explanation. I did not have a word for what he described, not in my own language, not in any language I had studied across my years of service. My people spoke of duty, of obligation, of the strategic value of protecting valuable assets. We did not speak of choosing pain for another person simply because it was the right thing to do, with no expectation of recognition or reward. I began to understand, slowly and with a growing unease, that this quality was not unique to Ethan Hale alone. It seemed to live somewhere deep within his entire species, a thread of stubborn, illogical devotion that made them far more dangerous and far more remarkable than any report I had ever read suggested. Word of my frequent visits eventually reached ears I had hoped would remain unaware. Commander Sayel summoned me to her office on the 5th day, her expression colder than I had seen it since my initial request for reassignment. You have spent considerably more time with the specimen than your assignment requires, she said without preamble. Understanding requires proximity, Commander. Understanding requires objectivity, she countered, her voice sharpening, something I am no longer confident you possess where this human is concerned. I felt heat rise beneath my skin, though I forced my expression to remain still. My reports have been thorough and accurate. If you have concerns regarding their quality, I welcome your review. She studied me for a long moment, and something in her gaze softened slightly, though her voice did not. I do not question your reports, Varen. I question your reasons for writing them so carefully. I did not answer, because I did not trust myself to speak without revealing more than I intended. Command has decided, she continued, that a second demonstration will be arranged. A more decisive one this time, given the unexpected outcome of the first. The specimen's continued value depends heavily on how he performs. Something cold settled in my chest at her words. Decisive in what sense, Commander? In the sense that this match will not be decided by a single fall, she said, her eyes holding mine steadily. It will be decided by whichever combatant remains standing when the other cannot rise at all. I understood the implication clearly enough, though she did not speak it directly. This time the demonstration would not end when someone lost their footing. This time it would end only when someone could no longer continue at all, and there would be no guarantee, no promise, that the one unable to continue would still be breathing when it was over. I left her office with my hands clenched at my sides, my mind already racing toward the small quarters where Ethan Hale waited, unaware of what Command had decided for him, unaware that the strange, careful distance I had been trying to maintain between us was about to collapse entirely under the weight of what I was no longer willing to simply observe from behind glass. I found him standing by the narrow window again, watching the stars, and I did not give myself time to reconsider before the words left me. They are arranging a second match, I said. This time it will not end until one of you cannot continue. He turned from the window slowly, and for the first time since I had known him, something flickered across his face that might have been genuine concern, though it settled quickly into the same steady calm I had come to expect from him. When? He asked. 2 days, I said. Command has not chosen your opponent yet, but I have heard them discussing candidates far stronger than Korath. They intend this to end differently. You mean they intend for me to lose? He said, without any bitterness in his voice, simply stating the fact as he understood it. I should not have told you this, I said quietly. It is a violation of protocol. If Commander Sal learns I warned you, the consequences for me will be severe. He studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted into a quiet gratitude that made my chest ache in a way I still did not have adequate words for. Then why did you tell me? I did not have a simple answer. I had told myself, walking through the corridors toward his quarters, that it was a matter of accuracy, that a subject facing a deadly encounter deserved to understand the stakes clearly for the sake of complete behavioral data. But standing there, watching him absorb the news with that same unshakable steadiness, I understood the truth was far simpler and far more dangerous than any professional justification. Because I did not want you to walk into it unprepared, I said finally, because the thought of you facing that without warning was unbearable to me. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, softly, "That's a big thing to admit, coming from someone who's supposed to be studying me like a specimen. You stopped being a specimen to me several days ago," I admitted, the words slipping free before I could stop them. I do not know when it happened. I only know that it did. Something passed between us in that silence, quiet and fragile and entirely new, and neither of us spoke of it further that evening, though I felt its weight settle over every word we exchanged afterward. The 2 days that followed passed with a strange, suspended tension, each hour thick with the knowledge of what was coming. I continued my visits, unwilling to abandon him to isolation before the match, and Commander Sael's suspicion of me grew sharper with each passing cycle, though she said nothing further, watching instead with the patient, calculating attention of someone waiting for a mistake she already expected to see. On the morning of the match, I learned the identity of his opponent through a briefing I had not been invited to attend, overheard instead through a partially open door as two officers discussed the arrangements in low voices. They had selected a Vraxian combat specialist named Threll, a soldier trained specifically for lethal engagements, chosen deliberately because his methods left little room for the kind of improvised resistance Ethan had shown against Korath. I found Ethan in the small preparation room before the match, sitting quietly with his hands loosely clasped, his eyes closed, and for a moment I feared to disturb whatever private strength he was gathering. But he opened his eyes when I entered, and the small, tired smile he offered me undid something in my chest that I had been holding together through sheer force of will. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I could not stay away," I answered honestly. The combat deck was more crowded than before, word of the first match having spread across the station, drawing officers from every department eager to witness whether the humans' earlier victory had been skill or simple luck. I took my place at the rail, my hands already trembling, and watched as Ethan Hale walked out to face an opponent far more dangerous than the one before. Threll moved with a precision that made my stomach tighten from the very first exchange. Each strike calculated, efficient, aimed with a coldness that Korath's brute strength had lacked. Ethan fought differently against him, more careful, more measured, absorbing less punishment than before, but finding fewer openings to exploit in return. The match stretched on, longer and more brutal than the first, and with every blow Ethan endured, I felt something inside me fraying further, until I could no longer simply stand and watch as I had promised myself I would. Threll drove Ethan back against the far wall with a combination of strikes that left him struggling to remain upright, and in that moment, watching him falter for the first time since I had known him, I made a decision that would cost me everything I had built across years of careful, disciplined service. I left the rail and moved quickly toward the control station near the edge of the platform, where a junior technician sat monitoring the deck's environmental systems, unaware of the decision forming in my mind. I could not stop the match directly. Command had made clear there would be no interference once it began. But the deck's lighting system, calibrated for optimal visibility during demonstrations, could be adjusted, and a sudden brief flicker of darkness, disorienting enough to break Threll's rhythm for even a few seconds, might be enough. It was a small thing. It was also a clear violation of every rule I had sworn to uphold. I did it anyway. The lights dimmed for less than 2 seconds, barely noticeable to those simply watching from the rail, but enough, I hoped, to disrupt the precise timing Threll relied upon. When the lights returned to normal, Ethan had used the brief confusion to slip free of the corner Threll had trapped him in, putting distance between them, buying himself the few crucial seconds he needed to steady his breathing and gather what remained of his strength. I did not know, standing there with my heart pounding and my hands cold with the weight of what I had just risked, whether my small act of interference had truly changed anything, or whether Ethan would have found his own way free regardless. I only knew that in that moment, watching him straighten his shoulders once more against an opponent that should have overwhelmed him easily, something fierce and unfamiliar had risen in me, refusing to remain passive while he fought for his life below. The match continued, brutal and uncertain, until finally, in a moment I would replay countless times afterward, Ethan found the same opening he had found against Korath, a small gap in Threll's otherwise flawless defense, and drove every remaining ounce of strength into a single decisive strike that finally brought his opponent down. Threll did not rise again before the match officials called the contest concluded. The silence that followed was different from the silence after the first match. There was no murmur of disbelief this time, only a heavy, uncertain quiet, as though everyone present understood they had witnessed something that defied every assumption they had carried into that room. I found Commander Sael watching me from across the platform, her expression unreadable, and I understood immediately that she had noticed the lighting anomaly, that she suspected exactly what I had done and why. She said nothing in that moment. She simply turned and walked away, leaving me standing at the rail with my hands still trembling, watching as attendants helped Ethan Hale from the floor below, his steps unsteady, his body clearly pushed beyond what it should have been able to endure. I did not know, watching him leave the combat deck that day, what price I would ultimately pay for the choice I had made. I only knew, with a certainty that surprised me more than anything else that had happened since his capture, that I would have made the same choice again without hesitation, and that whatever consequences awaited me, they could not outweigh the simple, undeniable relief of watching him walk away still breathing. Commander Sale summoned me to her office before the following morning cycle had even fully begun, and I walked there already knowing that whatever came next would change everything about the life I had built since joining the Coalition fleet. She did not waste time with formalities. "You disabled the lighting array during yesterday's match," she said, the moment the door closed behind me. Deliberately, during an active demonstration. I considered denying it, for the length of a single breath, and then found I no longer had the will to hide behind a lie. "Yes, Commander, I did." Something flickered across her face, surprise perhaps, or something closer to disappointment, though I could not be certain which. "Do you understand what this means? Interference during an authorized demonstration is a direct violation of Coalition conduct. Command will not simply overlook it, regardless of the outcome." "I understand," I said quietly. "Then explain to me," she said, her voice sharper now, "why an officer, with your record, your discipline, would risk everything you have built for the sake of a specimen assigned to your study." I stood there for a long moment, searching for some careful, professional phrasing that might soften the truth into something more acceptable. I found none. "Because he is not a specimen to me, Commander. He has not been for some time. I could not stand and watch him die for the sake of a demonstration meant only to prove a point that had already been proven wrong once before." She was silent for a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not read. "You understand this admission will be recorded. Command will demand a formal review. At best, you will be reassigned far from this outpost. At worst, you will be discharged from service entirely. I understand the risk, Commander. And still you would make the same choice again." It was not truly a question, though she waited, as though expecting an answer regardless. "Yes," I said, "I would." She studied me for a long moment longer, and then, to my surprise, something in her rigid posture eased slightly, though her voice remained formal. "I served alongside a human liaison once, many years ago, before you joined this fleet," she said quietly. "I did not understand him either, not fully, not until it was far too late to matter. Perhaps you have simply learned that lesson sooner than I did." She did not explain further, and I did not ask, though the admission lingered strangely between us, softening something I had not expected to find softened at all. The formal review came 2 days later, conducted by a panel of senior officers who reviewed the footage of the lighting anomaly with cold, careful attention, questioning me at length about my motivations, my relationship with the human prisoner, and my understanding of the consequences my actions had risked. I answered honestly, offering no excuses, no attempts to minimize what I had done, and when they finally dismissed me to await their decision, I felt strangely at peace despite the uncertainty ahead. Ethan found me later that evening, in the narrow corridor outside his quarters, his steps still careful from the injuries the second match had left him with. "I heard about the review," he said. "Is it bad?" "It may end my career with the Coalition," I admitted, "but I do not regret what I did to help you." He was quiet for a moment, studying me with an expression I had never seen from him before, something raw and unguarded beneath the usual calm. "You didn't have to risk that for me." "I know," I said. "I chose to anyway." "Why?" he asked, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer, and simply needed to hear it spoken aloud. I thought of the moment on the observation platform, days ago now, when I had first whispered those words to myself in the emptiness after his first match, never intending anyone to hear them. I thought of every conversation since, every quiet evening spent learning the strange, stubborn kindness that lived at the center of him. Every moment I had told myself was simply professional interest, and had known, even then, was something far deeper. "Because I wished you were mine," I said quietly, finally speaking the words directly to him instead of to the silence of an empty room. "From the very first moment I watched you refuse to be broken. I did not understand it then. I understand it now." He crossed the small distance between us, slowly, as though giving me every opportunity to step away if I chose to, and when I did not, he reached up and gently touched the side of my face, his fingers careful against skin so different from his own. "I think," he said softly, "I've wished the same thing since the day you told me about the second match, knowing exactly what it would cost you to warn me." 3 days later, the Coalition panel delivered their decision. I was to be stripped of my rank and reassigned to a distant administrative post, far from any active fleet operations. My career within the Coalition military effectively ended. It was, by every measure I had once used to define my worth, a devastating outcome. I felt strangely calm as I listened to the verdict, because by then I had already made a decision of my own, one that made the panel's judgment feel almost irrelevant by comparison. Ethan Hale's continued detainment had become a matter of growing political complexity, with representatives from his own government finally arriving at the outpost to negotiate his release following the widely witnessed outcome of his second match. I met with him one final time before his transport departed, standing together in the quiet observation deck where I had first watched him refuse to fear his captors. "Come with me," he said simply, before I could speak at all. "Not as a prisoner escort, not as an assignment. Just come." "I no longer hold any rank that would grant me passage," I said. "I am simply a discharged officer now, with nowhere left within the Coalition that wants me." "Then don't come as an officer," he said, taking my hand gently in his. "Come as someone who chose me, even when it cost her everything she'd built." I looked out at the stars beyond the observation window, the same stars we had once discussed together in his small quarters, back when I told myself I was simply gathering data, simply completing an assignment, simply doing my duty as an officer of the Coalition fleet. None of that had ever been entirely true, and I no longer saw any reason to pretend otherwise. "Yes," I said, and felt something settle into place inside my chest that had been unsettled since the very first day I watched him smile at a threat meant to break him. "I will come with you." The transport that carried us away from the outpost was small and simple, nothing like the vast Coalition vessels I had served aboard for years, and yet I felt no fear as it pulled away from the station, no regret for the rank and career I had left behind. Ethan sat beside me, his hand still resting over mine, watching the same stars I had once studied from behind a pane of reinforced glass, back when he was simply a specimen, assigned for my observation, and I was simply an officer following orders I no longer fully believed in. "You never did finish your report on me," he said, after a long, comfortable silence, a small smile touching the corner of his mouth. "I do not think a report could ever fully capture what I learned," I said honestly. "Your species is not weak, as my people were taught to believe. You are simply willing to give everything for the people you care about, without calculation, without hesitation, without any expectation of reward. It is the most remarkable thing I have ever witnessed." "And what did you learn about yourself, watching all that?" he asked quietly. I considered the question carefully, thinking back through every moment since the day I first saw him standing unafraid before guards meant to break him, through every quiet evening spent learning his stubborn, unshakable kindness, through the desperate choice I had made in a darkened corner of the combat deck, refusing to simply watch him fall. "I learned," I said finally, "that some things are worth choosing, even when every rule I had ever followed told me not to." He turned to look at me then, and something passed between us that needed no translation, no careful diplomatic phrasing, nothing but the simple, quiet understanding of two people who had found something neither of them had expected to find, in the unlikeliest of circumstances. "I wish he were mine," I had whispered once, alone and afraid of my own feelings, watching a stranger refuse to be broken by creatures far stronger than himself. He was not a stranger any longer. He was not simply a wish spoken quietly into an empty room. He was beside me now, his hand warm over mine, carrying us both toward a future neither of us could fully predict, and for the first time since I had joined the Coalition fleet so many years ago, I found that I was not afraid of the uncertainty ahead at all. I was simply, finally, exactly where I wanted to be.